I thought I knew where I was going. I had the plans, the calendar, the urgency. March was coming fast, and the world said, move now or miss your moment. But then I stopped. Not because I wanted to, because something deeper whispered, wait. Have you ever been so close to a decision that your heart was already packed and ready to leave, only to feel heaven gently place a hand on your chest and say, not yet? That moment changed everything. Because I realized something that night. God doesn't shout directions over the noise of our panic. He waits for us to quiet the storm inside. I asked where to go. I expected a map, a sign, a clear answer that made sense. Instead, I received stillness. And in that stillness, I felt exposed, stripped of certainty, forced to confront the fear we rarely admit out loud, the fear that if we stop moving, we'll be forgotten. But what if stopping is exactly where faith begins? What if the delay isn't a denial, but an invitation? There are moments in life when God doesn't change your location, He changes you. Moments when the road ahead stays hidden, not to punish you, but to teach you how to walk by trust instead of sight. I learned that obedience doesn't always look heroic. Sometimes it looks like waiting while everyone else runs ahead. Sometimes it looks like staying when leaving would be easier. Sometimes it feels like standing in the dark, believing that dawn is still coming. And here's the truth we don't hear enough. Divine timing often feels uncomfortable before it feels miraculous, because transformation requires surrender, and surrender costs us our illusion of control. But when the answer finally came, it wasn't just about where to go. It was about who I needed to become before I got there. I discovered that God cares less about how fast you arrive, and more about whether your heart is ready when you do. If you're watching this and you feel stuck, if you're racing against a clock only you can hear, if you're praying for direction and hearing silence, don't turn away, because the silence may be sacred, the waiting may be shaping you, and the place you're being sent to might not change your life nearly as much as the journey of learning to trust before you arrive. Stay with me. This isn't just a story about where to go. It's about discovering why your next step matters more than you ever imagined. There comes a moment when urgency starts to feel like truth. The clock gets louder, the pressure tightens. Everyone around you is moving, deciding, locking things in. And you start to believe that if you don't act now, you'll lose everything that was meant for you. That's where I was standing in front of a deadline, convinced that speed was obedience, that motion meant faith. March was approaching, and every logical voice said, go now, choose now, don't hesitate. But faith doesn't always arrive with adrenaline. Sometimes it comes quietly, almost inconveniently, asking you to pause when momentum feels necessary. I asked for direction expecting clarity, certainty, a green light. Instead, what I felt was restraint, not fear, not confusion, restraint, as if heaven itself was saying, you're early, not late. That's a hard word for people who have learned to equate waiting with failure. We're trained to believe that doors close forever, that opportunities expire, that God works on human schedules. But divine direction doesn't rush. It doesn't panic. It doesn't compete. It moves with precision, not pressure. The strangest part was realizing that nothing external had changed. The same options were still there, the same timeline, the same expectations. What changed was my awareness that moving too soon could cost more than staying still, that obedience before the deadline mattered more than arriving on time. Waiting exposed everything I was trying to outrun: my need for control, my fear of being overlooked, my desire to prove that I was capable of choosing my own path. And in that exposure, something sacred began to surface. Not an answer yet, not a destination, but the understanding that when God interrupts urgency, it's never to delay your purpose, it's to protect it. There are moments when urgency disguises itself as wisdom. The calendar tightens, the pressure builds, and suddenly speed feels spiritual. I was staring down a deadline, convinced that if I didn't move before March, I would miss what God had for me. Every voice around me said, now or never, act or lose it, choose quickly or be left behind. And I believed them because fear speaks fluently when time feels scarce. I brought that anxiety into prayer, expecting direction, a clear destination, a signal to accelerate. Instead, what met me was resistance, not confusion, not uncertainty, but a firm, quiet hesitation. It felt as though heaven was unmoved by my urgency, as if God was untouched by the ticking clock that had consumed me. In that moment, I realized how easily pressure can be mistaken for purpose. Waiting revealed something uncomfortable. I wasn't afraid of making the wrong choice as much as I was afraid of making no choice at all. Stillness felt dangerous. Pausing felt like falling behind. Yet the restraint I felt carried peace, not panic. It suggested that divine timing doesn't react to deadlines, it establishes them. Nothing around me changed. The opportunity was still there. The path was still possible. The only thing shifting was my understanding that obedience is not measured by speed. Moving too early can be just as costly as moving too late. Sometimes the instruction to wait is not about the place you're going, but about the posture of your heart when you arrive. In that pause, layers of fear surfaced: fear of irrelevance, fear of missing out, fear that trust might not be rewarded. And beneath those fears was a deeper truth slowly rising: the realization that when God interrupts urgency, it is often because what feels like delay is actually alignment, because purpose is not rushed, because protection can sound like silence, because timing is not something we manage, but something we are invited to trust, while everything in us wants to run. Urgency has a way of dressing itself up as responsibility. The closer the deadline gets, the more convincing it sounds. I was staring at March like it was a wall closing in, believing that if I didn't move before it arrived, I would lose what had been prepared for me. The pressure felt holy. The rush felt justified. Every instinct said that faith meant stepping forward quickly, proving readiness by action, proving trust by speed. So I asked for direction with a restless heart. I expected a destination, a confirmation, a sense of momentum. What came instead was a pause so firm it felt deliberate. Not silence filled with confusion, but silence weighted with intention. It was unsettling because it forced me to notice how much of my urgency was rooted in fear rather than trust. Fear of being left behind, fear of missing the moment, fear that waiting would somehow disqualify me. Stillness exposed how deeply I had tied God's will to my timeline. I realized I had assumed that divine opportunity expires like a contract, that heaven operates on countdowns. But the restraint I felt carried a strange calm, as if time itself had slowed down in that space. It made me confront the truth that I was more afraid of stopping than I was of choosing wrongly. Nothing outward shifted. The doors didn't close. The options didn't vanish. The pressure didn't magically disappear. What changed was my understanding that obedience isn't proven by how fast you move, but by how willing you are to listen when movement is withheld. Acting too soon can fracture what patience is meant to strengthen. In the waiting, the deeper struggle surfaced. Control loosened its grip. The need to prove myself began to fade. I started to sense that the interruption wasn't about delaying progress but about refining direction, that what felt like resistance was actually guidance, that being held in place was shaping something unseen, something necessary, something that could not be rushed, something that required trust before steps, surrender before certainty. And a willingness to believe that timing is not an obstacle, but an instrument in the hands of God. There was a moment when the deadline started to feel like a threat instead of a date. March stood there like a door that would slam shut if I didn't reach it in time. Everything around me reinforced the same message. Move faster, decide now, don't hesitate. The pressure felt righteous, almost spiritual, as if urgency itself were proof of obedience. I told myself that faith meant action, that trusting God meant stepping forward quickly before the opportunity slipped away. When I finally stopped long enough to ask for direction, I wasn't really asking where to go. I was asking for permission to rush. I expected a clear answer, a push, a sense of green light momentum. What I encountered instead was restraint, a quiet resistance that didn't argue with me, didn't explain itself, didn't panic. It simply held me still. That stillness was uncomfortable because it forced me to see how tightly fear had wrapped itself around my sense of purpose. Waiting exposed the belief I didn't want to admit, that God's plans were fragile, that they depended on my speed, that one misstep could undo everything. The pause challenged that lie. It suggested that divine direction doesn't react to pressure, that it isn't intimidated by timelines, that it operates with an accuracy that doesn't need haste. The longer I sat with it, the clearer it became that my urgency was rooted in fear of loss, fear of being forgotten, fear of standing still while others moved ahead. Nothing outside of me changed during that pause. The options remained. The door didn't close. The path didn't disappear. What changed was my awareness that moving too early could distort what patience was meant to protect. That obedience sometimes looks like restraint. That timing is not something to outrun, but something to submit to. That when heaven interrupts your rush, it is often because there is something being guarded beneath the delay, something forming quietly while you are being asked to trust without motion. I thought I knew where I was going. I had to believe without proof, the calendar, to stay present in the tension. March was coming fast, and the world said, "Move now or miss didn't arrive all at once." But then I stopped. It crept in because I wanted to, disguised as responsibility. Have you ever been so close to a decision that I needed to act before March and ready to leave, only to feel heaven gently place a hand on your chest? The louder the urgency became, that moment convincing me that hesitation was disobedience. Because I realized something that night. God doesn't shout directions that if I slowed down, I would fall behind. He waits for us to quiet the storm inside. Divine opportunity. I asked where to go. Through my fingers if I didn't grab it fast enough. A clear answer that brought that urgency into prayer. Not realizing I was already stillness, I felt exposed. I wasn't really seeking direction. Forced to confront confirmation. Rarely admit out loud the fear that if we stop moving, clarity, movement. But what if stopping is exactly instead I felt a firm, quiet resistance. What if the delay isn't a denial, no alternative plan, just a deep sense in life when God doesn't change your location? It was unsettling because it stripped away my moments when the road ahead stays hidden. How much of my faith was entangled with how to walk by trust. Waiting revealed what motion. I learned that obedience doesn't always look heroic. I was afraid that God's plans were fragile. Sometimes it looks like waiting while everyone else runs ahead. Sometimes it looks like staying when leaving would be easier. Sometimes the restraint I felt like standing in the dark, not anxiety, dawn is as if heaven was unbothered by the clock. And here's the truth we don't hear enough. It forced me divine timing the idea that divine timing is not pressured by deadlines and does not because transformation requires nothing around me shift and surrender costs us our illusion of control. The
But
same
when the answer
expectations
finally
remained.
came, it wasn't
What
just about
changed
where
was
to
my
go.
understanding
It was
that
about who I needed
obedience
to
is
become
not
before
always
I got
about
there.
moving
I
forward.
discovered that God
Sometimes
cares
it
less
is about
about
how
how
fast
fast
you
you
arrive,
arrive and more about whether your heart is
Sometimes
ready when you
direction
do.
comes not
If you're
as a place
watching
to
this
go,
and you
but
feel
as a
stuck,
command to stay.
if you're
Sometimes
racing against
God
a clock,
interrupts
only you can
urgency
hear.
not to
If you're
delay
praying
destiny,
for
but
direction
to
and
protect
hearing
it,
silence,
to refine
don't
the
turn
heart
away,
before the step,
because the
to
silence
teach
may be
trust without
sacred.
motion,
The waiting
to
may be
loosen the
shaping
grip
you,
of fear
and the
that
place you're
believes
being sent to
everything
might
must
not
happen
change your
now
life
or not at
nearly
all.
as much as
To
the journey
form
of
something
learning to
deeper in
trust
the
before
waiting
you
where
arrive.
faith learns to
Stay with
breathe
me.
without
This
rushing.
isn't just a story about where to go.